The fluorescent lights hummed overhead like an electric prayer, casting Seattle General's ER in that particular shade of white that made 6:16 a.m. feel like midnight. Megan O'Brien pushed through the staff entrance with her badge clipped to scrubs that had seen better decades, shoulders squared against the weight of a shift that hadn't started yet. The antiseptic smell hit first, that sharp, chemical bite that never quite masked the underneath, copper, sweat, the faint decay of bodies wearing out. She moved through the corridor with the kind of invisibility that came from 12 years of practice, the kind that made people's eyes slide past her like she was part of the infrastructure. Her hands were scarred. Not dramatically, no missing fingers, no patches of grafted skin, but a web of thin white lines that told their own story to anyone trained to read it. A piece of shrapnel from Ramadi. A burn from a defibrillator paddle when she'd grabbed it barehanded to save a patient whose heart had decided to stop. She kept them busy as she walked, checking supplies, organizing the crash cart with the precision of someone who'd done this exact motion 10,000 times. The worn leather of her combat boots, regulation black, laces tied in a way that took exactly 8 seconds, clicked softly against the tile floor. She'd kept them. Should have thrown them out 3 years ago when the army told her to disappear, but some things you don't throw away. Trauma Bay 3 was her station. She'd requested it 6 months ago, not for any reason she could articulate to anyone who asked, but because the angle of the door let you see the entire ER without being obviously watched. She arranged the monitors, checked the ventilator tubing, made sure the crash boxes were restocked. Everything in its place. Everything ready. Her fingers moved through the routine like someone playing a song she'd learned so long ago it had become muscle memory instead of thought. The overhead page crackled at 6:52 a.m. Incoming trauma. ETA 8 minutes. Training accident, suspected tension pneumothorax, alert trauma team to Bay 1. Her spine straightened. She didn't move, couldn't let anyone see her move, but something shifted in the machinery of her chest. Tension pneumothorax meant a collapsed lung that was compressing the other one, squeezing the heart. 8 minutes wasn't a lot of time. 8 minutes was almost too much time. She was pulling on a fresh pair of gloves when the ambulance bay doors hissed open. The paramedics moved with controlled urgency, the kind that meant the patient was barely holding on. They wheeled the stretcher past Bay 1, and Megan caught a glimpse, unconscious male, late 30s, dark hair, the kind of physique you got from 14-hour workdays in a gym. Her hands went still. She knew that face. Captain Derek Vance. The officer whose testimony at her court-martial 3 years ago had been delivered with the precision of a scalpel. He'd sat in that room in the JAG office and explained, very calmly, how Major O'Brien had exceeded her operational authority in Ramadi. How she'd ordered a raid that hadn't been sanctioned. How the classified intelligence she'd acted on had come from an intercepted communication she had no authorization to access. He hadn't looked angry. He hadn't looked disappointed. He'd looked like a man checking boxes on a form, and when the last box was checked, they'd erased her. Honorable discharge signed by a major general who'd never met her. Her name removed from the roster. Her medical record sealed. Orders to never contact her unit, never reveal her rank, never acknowledge the 3 tours or the 2 purple hearts locked in a box at the bottom of her closet. The army had turned her into a ghost and told her that if she surfaced, it would mean prison or worse. And now he was unconscious on a stretcher with a tube down his throat. Her body moved before her brain could catch up. 12 years of ER nursing had taught her that you don't freeze, not when someone's dying. You don't think about court-martials or betrayals or the way your entire life got erased in 47 minutes. You breathe. You work. Your hands take over. What do we have? She was asking, moving to the stretcher, already checking his pupils, his pulse, the rhythm on the portable cardiac monitor. The paramedic was running through the report, fell from a ladder during construction training, blunt force trauma to the right chest wall, O2 sat dropped to 64 en route, breath sounds absent on right side. Get me on the bed. Now. Not a question. Not deferential. Just command, and the 3 paramedics moved like she'd pulled a string. She helped them transfer him to the base stretcher, contact with his skin sending a current through her that she forced down, buried, locked away. He weighed about 210 pounds. His skin was warm. She could smell sunscreen and sweat and something underneath that was pure adrenaline. The ER team materialized. 2 residents, a physician's assistant, a respiratory therapist. Someone was establishing for access. Someone else was preparing the intubation kit. But Megan was already listening to his chest with a stethoscope that had cost her $40 and been worth every penny since her first tour in 2009. Right side. Nothing. Flat as a desert. The left side was trying to compensate, working harder, the breath sounds labored and desperate. Needle decompression, she said. Second intercostal space, midclavicular line. He's in full pneumothorax, compression of the mediastinum, and the swellings affecting venous return. Move. We need to wait for Dr. Ashford, one of the residents said. Young guy, early 30s, the kind of careful that came from fear of making decisions. Megan was already prepping the site, already swabbing antiseptic, her fingers moving with the terrifying fluid precision of someone who'd done this in a mortar fire. His O2 is 58 and dropping. His heart rate is 142. His blood pressure is bottoming out. If we wait for Ashford, he dies in the next 90 seconds. Move. She didn't watch their faces. Didn't watch the resident nod and step aside. Just felt the weight of the large bore angiocath in her hand, felt the resistance when it broke through the fascia, felt the sudden hiss of air escaping, that specific sound of pressure releasing, of a lung trying to re-expand. The monitor responded immediately. O2 sat climbed. 62, 68. 71, the heart rate began its descent from panic. His body was fighting to survive, and her hands were giving it the room to do it. That's when Dr. Ashford appeared in the doorway. She felt it before she saw it, the way the air in the room changed, the way his presence made the fluorescent light seem to dim. He was tall, maybe 6'2", with a kind of tailored confidence that came from growing up with a name like Ashford. His father had been a surgeon here, his grandfather a hospital administrator in Seattle. That was the kind of weight he carried, not competence exactly, but the expectation of competence, the assumption that power was something he'd inherited along with his monogrammed cuff links. And his face was draining of color. She watched it happen in real time. She was still working, checking the needle placement, monitoring the stats, preparing for the chest tube they'd need to fully resolve this, but she caught the exact moment his eyes went wide, the exact moment he looked at Vance's face, then at her, then at something she couldn't see. A monitor. A file. The subtle clinical notation that flags certain military veterans for NSA surveillance, the kind of alert that only showed up if you knew what you were looking for. The kind of classified indicator that shouldn't exist in a civilian hospital system at all. His mouth opened. Closed. Opened again. Get me a size 28 chest tube kit and a thoracic tray, Megan said, her voice carrying the kind of weight that made the resident jump. She didn't look at Ashford. Didn't acknowledge that he was standing 3 feet away with his hand half raised, suspended in the moment between speaking and silence. And someone page anesthesia. He's going to need a CT when he's stable, and we need a full trauma surgery consult. Nurse, Ashford's voice came out wrong. Thin. Not the deep authority she remembered from his testimony. Sir, I need this room clear except for essential personnel. She wasn't rude about it. That was the thing that would matter later. She wasn't rude. She was just impossibly calm, impossibly professional, impossibly competent. This patient is crashing and I need you to step back. The resident was already placing the chest tube. Megan guided his hands with the kind of gentle correction that would teach him without humiliating him. The tube went in smoothly, and immediately the drainage port began flowing dark, serous fluid, the liquid that had been compressing Vance's lungs finally finding a way out. The monitor stabilized further. His color improved from the shade of wet concrete to something approaching human. Get me 2 units O negative and a liter of normal saline wide open, she said. And get me his full trauma imaging protocol. Chest, abdomen, pelvis, and we need to rule out head injury. Full C-spine precautions until we clear it. Ashford was still standing in the doorway. She didn't have to look at him to know it. Could feel the weight of his presence like a storm system building pressure overhead. Could feel the exact moment he realized what he'd seen, not just a nurse with unusual competence, but a nurse with the kind of training that didn't come from civilian medical schools. The kind of training that came from field medicine. Combat medicine. The kind of medicine you learned when people were dying in dust and darkness and you were the only thing standing between them and the end. He'd seen her hands move. And he'd recognized what those hands were. The overhead page crackled across the floor at 2:13 a.m., and every orderly within earshot smirked. Nurse Meggie to administration. Nurse Meggie. That diminutive nickname hung in the air like second-hand smoke, a thing designed to be diminishing, a thing designed to be heard. Megan heard it from Bay 7 where she was restocking the crash cart with fresh syringes. She set the box down. She didn't rush. The orderlies watched her walk toward the administrative corridor with expressions that suggested they already knew what was waiting for her, and the fact that they were smiling told her everything she needed to know about what Dr. Ashford had planned. The supply closet door closed behind her before she could knock. Ashford was already inside, his silhouette backlit by the harsh fluorescent panel overhead that buzzed like an insect trapped in a light fixture. He didn't offer her a seat. He didn't offer her anything except the cold measure of his stare, a man who'd spent the last 2 hours assembling his case like a surgeon preparing instruments. "The board has concerns," he said. His voice carried the texture of someone who'd rehearsed this, low and controlled and edged with something that wasn't quite anger but wasn't quite restraint either. "Concerns about your judgment. Your decision-making in high-stress situations." Megan stood still. Her hands hung at her sides, palms forward, a posture that made her smaller than she was. When a patient like Captain Vance arrives, there are protocols. Established channels. You bypass 3 layers of review to get hands-on with a trauma case that should have gone to Dr. Sterling's team. He stepped closer. The air in the closet felt diminished, rationed. "What I'm concerned about is whether you have the emotional stability for this department. Whether you understand your place in the hierarchy." One measured breath. That was all she allowed herself. The tear that escaped, if it came at all, would wipe away in one swift motion, her hand steady as a surveillance camera. "You moved as if you'd been trained for exactly that kind of crisis," Ashford continued, his eyes narrowing as if he were seeing something beneath her skin. "That concerns me. Nurses don't move that way. Nurses don't have that kind of muscle memory. Nurses don't," he stopped himself. "They don't know things before they happen." The silence lasted 3 seconds. Then Megan met his eyes, not defiant, not pleading, just level. A person looking directly into the source of the threat and acknowledging it without flinching. "You're making a mistake," she said quietly. "You'll spend the rest of your career regretting." The words were delivered with the kind of calm that made his jaw tighten. Not a threat. A fact. The way someone states that a diagnosis is terminal, the way a surgeon announces the prognosis when there's nothing left to do but acknowledge what's already true. He didn't respond. He moved past her to open the closet door, and when he did, she caught the scent of his cologne, something expensive and aggressive, something that smelled like a man who'd never been told no in his life. The parking lot at shift change was controlled chaos. Incoming staff filtered through the employee entrance while outgoing staff moved toward their cars, the transition happening in that narrow window between night and dawn when the world felt unfinished. Dr. Ashford positioned himself near the main door, and he waited for Megan to emerge from the stairwell before he started talking. Not whisper talking. Full volume talking, the kind designed to travel across asphalt and reach every ear moving through that space. "Nurse O'Brien," he announced, his voice carrying the precision of a man who knew exactly how far sound could travel in the cold air. "The board has made some staffing adjustments. Effective immediately, you're reassigned to the night custodial rotation. Building maintenance, general sanitation, floor cleaning. Your nursing credentials will be on administrative hold pending review." The incoming staff slowed their pace. Some pretended not to hear. Some made eye contact with each other. One resident, a woman named Chen who'd worked with Megan on the trauma rotation, actually stopped walking. This is a precautionary measure, Ashford continued, given some recent concerns about judgment and scope of practice. The board feels this will give us time to evaluate your overall fit for the organization. Megan stood still. The cardboard box containing her personal locker items felt heavier than it should have, a cracked Coast Guard mug her father had carried on a cutter, a dying succulent she'd been trying to revive for 6 months, a photograph of her Ramadi team with half the faces redacted by markers and time and the kind of forgetting that governments insisted on. She'd taken maybe 2 seconds to pack it all when Ashford's assistant had appeared with the boxes. One measured breath. The tear came then, a single drop that escaped from her left eye, tracked down her cheek, and she caught it with her steady hand before it could reach her jawline. Around her, the medical staff pretended not to see it. That was the particular cruelty of humiliation in public, the witnesses who looked away, the silence that confirmed what Ashford had always known, that she had no one, that she stood alone, that there was no one to call who would believe what she was. She met Ashford's eyes. He was waiting for her to crack, waiting for the next tear, waiting for the moment when she would apologize or beg or acknowledge the finality of what he'd just announced. He'd positioned this perfectly, demotion delivered in front of the entire incoming team, stripped of her credentials in front of the staff who'd trusted her work, exiled to the night shift where she'd be invisible and isolated and easy to push out the door entirely. "You're making a mistake," she said, her voice carrying the weight of certainty across that parking lot. "You'll spend the rest of your career regretting it." The words landed differently the second time. Not a warning. A prophecy. The kind of statement that comes from someone who's already seen the future and found it implacable. Ashford's face darkened. He opened his mouth to respond, then closed it. Around them, the staff had gone very quiet. Chen was staring at Megan, not with sympathy, but with something closer to recognition, as if she'd just seen someone shed a skin and reveal something unfinished beneath it. The night shift began at 10:36 p.m. Megan stood in the custodial storage room on the basement level of Seattle General, surrounded by industrial-grade cleaning supplies and the smell of concentrated bleach, a smell that reminded her of forward operating bases and field hospitals and the way sterile environment always carried a faint edge of chemical desperation. They'd given her a uniform. Grey polyester that hung on her frame, a name tag that read maintenance, and a cart with 18 floors to cover between 11 p.m. and 7 a.m. She was on the 3rd floor, the surgical recovery wing, when the first alert came through the hospital intercom at 2:38 a.m. Not an overhead page. A code blue announcement, and then another, and then the sound of footsteps moving with purpose down corridors that had been quiet 30 seconds before. The stretcher came through the surgical bay doors with 4 people running alongside it. Megan saw the army patches first, digital camouflage on the shoulders of soldiers who weren't supposed to be injured in a training accident, soldiers whose wounds looked fresh and deliberate and like the kind of damage that came from something other than standard PT. The man on the stretcher was unconscious, his chest moving in shallow gasps, and his face was covered in the particular kind of grey that meant his body was losing the oxygen war. She didn't move. She held the mop handle, the grey uniform settling on her shoulders like a costume, and she watched the trauma team move past her toward the emergency bay. Then she heard the sound. The sound of air rushing from a sealed space. The sound of a tension pneumothorax that was happening right now, collapsing the soldier's lung with every breath he tried to take. Dr. Ashford was already moving toward the patient, but his hands had that uncertain quality, the hands of someone trained but not experienced, someone who'd read about this crisis but never lived through one at 3 in the morning with a dying man on the table. The needle decompression kit was locked in a cabinet. The security code had been changed. Megan watched this transaction from the threshold, the moment when Ashford realized the kit wasn't accessible, the moment when his face registered that they'd have to find another way, the moment when the soldier's oxygen sat was falling, 87, 82, 78, and the room had taken on the particular silence of people watching someone die. Muscle memory didn't announce itself. Her hands moved. The mop handle was gone. The cleaning cart was moving. She crossed into the bay with the certainty of someone who'd done this before, because at 2:44 p.m. on a dust-choked morning in Ramadi, she'd stood in a field hospital that was barely standing and she performed the same procedure with supplies that were barely functional. The flatline beep cut through the silence like mortar fire. The desert was there. The blood on sand. The sound of incoming. The breathing came shallow and fast and hot, and she could see the compound ahead, the room that held the things that 3 governments had agreed never happened, the evidence that would explain why she'd been erased from the face of official records, the reason she'd been ordered to disappear and told that surfacing would mean prison or worse. She blinked. The desert was gone. The soldier in front of her was coming back. His oxygen sat was climbing, 80, 85, 88, and his heart rate was stabilizing, and someone in the room had made a sound, a small gasp of recognition that came from a nurse she didn't know and went nowhere else because the next thing that happened was a voice from the doorway. Security. Dr. Ashford had pressed the emergency button. He stood at the threshold with his hand on the red button, his face showing something between rage and confusion and the terrible clarity of someone who'd just realized he'd made a move he couldn't take back. The security guard appeared within 60 seconds. 2 of them. They moved toward Megan with the practiced indifference of people who'd been asked to escort someone out of a building 1,000 times before. "You're going to need to step away from the patient," one of them said. The soldier's eyes opened. His hand shot out and caught her wrist. His fingers were strong, the fingers of someone who'd held a rifle, who'd run toward fire, who'd been trained to survive impossible things. He looked directly at her, his pupils dilating as his brain came back online, and then he whispered a single word that stopped every heart in that room. Valkyrie. The night shift stretched empty and vast. Seattle General's corridors became something different after midnight, long hallways of fluorescent hum and the particular quiet that comes when most of the living are somewhere else. Megan pushed the custodial cart past the ICU, her movements mechanical, precise, the kind of efficiency that required no thought anymore. A mop handle felt light in her hands compared to what she'd held in Ramadi. She wasn't thinking about that. She never let herself think about that. The cart wheel squeaked against linoleum as she turned toward the east wing. 3 hours into the shift. 4 more to go. This was her life now, invisible in motion, present without presence, the woman the orderlies didn't look at twice. She'd become very good at that particular art. 16 months of custodial duty had taught her the hospital's rhythms better than any nurse on day shift could have learned in years. She knew which machines beeped at what volume. She knew the sound of different codes. She knew which doctors slept standing up and which ones actually stayed awake during their overnight rotations. She knew Dr. Ashford had removed her access codes from the equipment cabinet that afternoon. She'd checked during her break, swiped her badge at the lock, and watched the red indicator light refuse her entry. Of course he had. The man was methodical. Cruel, certainly, but methodical about it, the kind of cruelty that came wrapped in policy and justified through procedure. He was choking her out slowly, making sure she had no access to anything that might remind the hospital she'd ever been a nurse at all. The cardiac monitor's rhythm came through the intercom first. Sharp. Wrong. The kind of alarm that made breathing stop involuntary. Code Blue, Trauma Bay 2. Code Blue, Trauma Bay 2. Megan's hand froze on the mop handle. She'd learned to not respond to codes anymore. Learned to keep pushing the cart, keep the head down, keep walking like she hadn't heard. That was the deal she'd made with herself 3 months ago when Ashford had demoted her. Don't be a hero. Don't be anything. Just disappear. But the rhythm coming through the speaker, fast, chaotic, then suddenly nothing, sounded like the kind of nothing that meant someone was about to die. The kind of nothing she recognized from field triage in a bombed-out clinic where the power had failed and she'd worked by flashlight and muscle memory. She was moving before the second announcement finished. The trauma bay doors slammed open with her shoulder. 3 residents stood frozen around a bed. Captain Derek Vance lay shirtless, his chest barely moving, his oxygen saturation on the monitor reading 58%. His face had gone the color of old bone. His breathing had stopped entirely. Tension pneumothorax. The collapsed lung was compressing his heart. In maybe 90 seconds, his heart would stop. In maybe 2 minutes after that, he would be dead. The chest tube kit was locked in the equipment cabinet 7 feet away. "Where's Ashford?" Megan's voice came out different. Lower. Not a question. A statement delivered with the kind of authority that made the nearest resident actually step back. "We paged him. He's not responding." The kit, the cabinet, the resident's words stumbled over each other. He was maybe 28, still had the softness of someone who hadn't learned yet that panic was useless. His code, Ashford removed all our access this afternoon and nobody knows the override. 45 seconds now. Maybe less. Megan was already moving to the trauma cart. She grabbed an MRE packet from the soldier's overnight bag. They'd brought his belongings in just in case. Her hands moved without asking permission from her mind. She tore open the plastic outer packaging, felt the texture of it, chemically treated polyethylene that had kept thousands of soldiers alive in places where medical equipment didn't exist. She held it at an angle, positioned it over Vance's second intercostal space where his chest wall had started to cave inward with each failed breath. "Get me tape. Now. The wide kind. All of it." The resident didn't move. Now is not a request. It's a command. He moved. The tape came in someone's hands, she didn't look at whose. Her eyes never left Vance's chest, never looked at his face, never acknowledged that this was the man who'd testified against her. That this was the officer whose words had erased her. She was no longer a nurse being fired from her civilian life. She was a major who'd done emergency medicine in a place where the rules didn't apply and the only rule was whether the patient lived. The plastic sealed against his skin. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't ideal. But it would work long enough. Oxygen. High flow. Non-rebreather now. She was already moving to his femoral artery, feeling for the pulse point beneath his groin, finding it with the same hands that had done this before under different circumstances. Fluid line. 2 large bore 18 gauge. Push saline. "Get me a blood draw for type and cross." A resident stood frozen. She looked up at him. Just looked. Her eyes were empty of everything except the calculation of survival statistics and the muscle memory of a trauma team operating by generator light in a compound 60 miles northeast of Ramadi. He reached for the saline. The oxygen saturation began to climb. 58. 62. The rhythm on the monitor changed from chaos into something more organized. Her hands worked with the terrible precision of someone who'd held far too many lives between their fingers. Someone who'd learned that pain was information and information could be data that changed who lived and who didn't. 68. Someone whispered. The residents were watching her now. All of them. She could feel their attention the way she'd felt the weight of heat radiating off mortar fire. They were watching her hands move. They were watching her posture change from the curved shoulders of the night custodian into something else entirely. Someone else entirely. She found the landmark on his chest, palpated 3 ribs down, positioned the needle with the kind of precision that came from doing this in the dark, in the cold, in places where the next breath couldn't be taken for granted. The intercostal approach was clean. Professional. Military. The O2 monitor beeped its progression upward. 72. 79. 85. Field dressing protocol, someone said quietly behind her. She didn't respond. She was too far gone into the work now. Too far into the part of herself she'd buried 3 years ago when the army had decided that Major Megan O'Brien had seen things that 3 governments agreed never happened. When they'd told her to disappear. When they'd made her into a ghost in her own country. 88%. 92. His breathing stabilized. The monitor's rhythm smoothed into something that approximated stability. Not healthy. Not saved. But no longer dying in the next 60 seconds. Megan stepped back. Her hands were shaking. Not from fear. From restraint. The room went so quiet you could hear the ventilator's mechanical hiss. One of the residents was staring at her hands. She saw it. Registered the flicker of attention to the scars visible on her wrists when she'd pushed her sleeves up. Scars that didn't come from needle sticks. Scars that came from desert blast radius and shrapnel that barely missed her radial artery. "I need some jello," she said quietly. "And someone should call the attending on call. Tell Dr. Ashford his patient is stable." She turned toward the door. "Wait." The resident's voice cracked. "Who are you? How did you?" But Megan was already gone. Back to the corridors. Back to the cart. Back to the particular art of being invisible in plain sight. She pushed the mop handle and tried not to think about the fact that she'd just revealed herself. That in the next hour, maybe less, someone would tell someone who would tell someone else. That her careful 3 years of disappearing had just ended in a trauma bay where she'd used language and movement and medical precision that no custodial worker should have possessed. The cart squeaked under her hands. She made it exactly 6 hallway turns before the code alarm came again. Different room. Different patient. But she heard her name called over the intercom, and this time it wasn't a nickname. This time it was a voice she recognized. Major. The soldier in 2. He's asking for. The intercom cut to static. She kept pushing the mop. The intercom cut to static. She kept pushing the mop. Ashford didn't appear again that night. She worked the custodial cart through the empty corridors at 2:27 a.m., pushing the same mop across the same tiles, watching the ammonia smell rise like ghosts. The soldier in Trauma 3 was already stable. Vance's monitors beeped a steady rhythm for floors up. And somewhere in this building, Ashford was making phone calls. She knew because that's what predators do when they realize the prey has teeth. By dawn, the calls had started. She felt it before she heard it, that specific shift in hospital politics when someone with power decides you're a problem. Residents who'd nodded at her in the hallway suddenly looked through her. Charge nurses checked the staffing board twice before assigning her a supply closet inventory that would keep her away from the units for 8 hours. The elevator doors opened on the 3rd floor and she saw 2 nurses being walked into human resources, their faces pale, one of them the woman who'd handed her the trauma shears during Vance's crash. Witnesses. Being neutralized. Ashford had learned quickly. Not threats. Not drama. Just the precise surgical removal of anyone who'd seen her do something impossible. By the time she finished inventory at 6:13 p.m., both nurses had been reassigned to night shift at Mercy General across the city. Different facility. Different ZIP code. Different universe from what they'd witnessed. She'd survived 3 combat rotations by recognizing patterns. This was the pattern of a man moving his pieces before the game collapsed. The thing about being erased from official existence is that you learn to recognize erasure in all its forms. The military had done it with paperwork and classified seals. Ashford was doing it with HR transfers and administrative maneuvering. The method changed. The result didn't. Security found her at 7:40 p.m. in the employee break room. 2 of them, both in the rent-a-cop uniforms that suggested Ashford had paid someone to make this fast and quiet. No discussion. No warning. Just a folder with termination papers and her name printed in capital letters above words like gross negligence and possible stolen valor. Stolen valor. The accusation landed like a fist because it was designed to, a veteran hearing that their service was fraudulent, that they'd claimed honors they didn't earn. Ashford knew exactly which buttons to push. She read the papers once. The signature was 3 days old. Predated. That meant he'd filled these out before she'd even pulled the tissue from that MRE packet, before she'd given the order to push epi, before she'd saved Captain Derek Vance's life while the trauma team watched with their hands hanging useless at their sides. Ashford had been planning her removal since the moment she'd touched that collapsed lung. The head of security, a man whose name she'd never learned, looked genuinely uncomfortable. Dr. Ashford said you'd understand. Says it's a discretion issue. Something from your background. One measured breath. That's what quiet dignity required. One breath and a steady voice. My badge. She unclipped it from her scrubs and placed it on the laminate table. The plastic was warm from her body. Everything moved slowly now, the way it did before contact, when adrenaline sharpened time into individual frames. She could see the reflection of the fluorescent lights in the badge surface, could hear the soft hum of the refrigerator in the corner, could smell the stale coffee that had been brewing since morning shift. I'll clear my locker. The security guard opened his mouth like he might say something kind. Then he didn't. Her locker was in the basement, a 6 by 12-inch space next to 40 identical ones. She had 3 minutes before someone would probably follow her, make sure she didn't take hospital property, make sure she didn't cause a scene. 3 minutes to pack 12 years of invisibility. The cracked Coast Guard mug was still there, the one her father had given her before her first deployment. Its handle had broken off in 2019, and she'd glued it back with epoxy that never quite held. The succulent she'd bought 6 months ago was brown on one side, neglect or radiator heat, she'd never figured out which. The photo went in last, the one from Ramadi with her team assembled on the roof of the compound after the operation, half their faces already redacted by the time the Pentagon returned their personal copies, their eyes blacked out by government order, their names erased. She packed them into a cardboard box that smelled like hospital linens. The box was 1/8 full. That was everything that mattered. The rain started as she pushed through the ER exit, soft at first, then with purpose. Norfolk in late September turned the sky the color of concrete, and the rain fell the way it did in the mountain provinces, hard enough to make sound, soft enough to feel like mercy. She walked 3 blocks because the bus stop was public and because walking gave her time to absorb the specific texture of losing everything again. The bench was wet. She sat anyway. The cardboard box went beside her, its corners already softening from rain that fell like applause. 3 hours earlier, she'd been necessary. She'd given an order and residents twice her age had obeyed. She'd read a body the way other people read faces, had called a crash before the monitors caught it, had turned a dying man into a breathing one with her hands and her voice and the muscle memory of 17 years in medicine. 3 hours later, she was someone with a cardboard box waiting for a bus at 8:22 p.m. in the rain. The bus shelter had a plastic roof that leaked from one corner, so she shifted the box deeper into the dry. A woman walked past with an umbrella, didn't offer. A man in a suit checked his phone and didn't look at her. The world was exactly as indifferent as it had always been. That was the thing about being invisible, it was so complete that no one saw you even when you were sitting directly in front of them. She opened the box and looked at the photo. Ramadi, July 2006. She could see her own shoulder in the frame, could see Petty Officer Chen on her left, could see Sergeant Holloway's hand on her back. All the faces that mattered. All of them redacted except for the margins. It was like looking at a story where someone had erased the characters and left only the setting. Maybe they were right. Maybe she'd always been the kind of person who brought damage to everything she touched. The court-martial had said so. The order to disappear had reinforced it. Ashford's calculations had confirmed it. By that logic, the only kindness she could offer was absence. Her hand moved toward the trash receptacle bolted to the shelter. The photo bent slightly in her wet fingers. She thought about dropping it. Thought about how easy it would be to let go of the last physical proof that she'd ever been Major Megan O'Brien of the 75th Ranger Regiment, that she'd led a trauma team, that she'd mattered for 7 years before the Pentagon decided she hadn't. The rain came harder. Not cold, just relentless, the way Ramadi heat was relentless, the way certain kinds of damage are relentless. Her eyes burned. But soldiers don't cry. They don't. They just sit in shelters with cardboard boxes and let the rain make decisions for them. She was about to let go. Then she heard it. Faint at first, almost lost in the rhythm of rain on plastic. A distinct sound cutting the night air, rotors. Distant. But growing closer. The acoustic signature of a UH-60 Black Hawk, the particular percussion of military-grade engines that she'd been trained to recognize in her sleep. She didn't move. Didn't look up. Just held the photo and listened as the sound grew louder, as the rain seemed to thin in response, as something on the far side of the city changed the trajectory of the night. The Black Hawk banked hard toward the hospital district. Its searchlight swept across the streets like a question written in light. And 3 blocks away, the rotor wash shook the windows of Seattle General so hard that Ashford, who was in his office reviewing the final paperwork of her dismissal, looked up from his desk with sudden and terrible understanding that he'd made a miscalculation. Vance's hand shot out the moment she passed his door. His fingers wrapped around her wrist like a clamp, and his eyes, fever-bright and focused, locked onto hers with the intensity of a man who'd been waiting 3 days for this moment. His voice came out ragged from the ventilator tube they'd extubated 6 hours earlier, a single word that stopped her blood cold. Valkyrie. Her call sign. The name that had been erased from every roster, every photo, every official record of the 75th Ranger Regiment. The name that belonged to a woman who no longer existed on paper. She didn't pull away. She didn't flinch. Her eyes met his and held, one small nod of acknowledgement, and then she heard the footsteps in the hallway. Running. Urgent. A young man in desert camouflage burst through the trauma unit doors, his uniform still creased from travel, his eyes wild as they scanned the beds until they found her face. Her son. 23 years old. Home on leave from Fort Campbell. His voice cracked across the entire wing. Major O'Brien saved my life twice. Once in Ramadi. Once by teaching me what honor looks like. The head nurse, Patterson, 13 years at Seattle General, was already fumbling with Vance's restricted file, the classified alerts bright red on the monitor. Her hands trembled as she read aloud, her voice barely above a whisper, but every word carried. She spoke about the officer who'd spent 2 years fighting through Pentagon bureaucracy to overturn a court-martial. About testimony he'd recanted. About a classified operation that the legal team had quietly ruled lawful after all. About how he'd tried to find her, only to discover Major Megan O'Brien had been officially erased from existence in 2019. Then the elevator doors opened. A SEAL team leader in dress blue stepped into the hallway flanked by 3 decorated Rangers, their medals catching the fluorescent lights like small accusations. His voice was calm, measured, the kind of authority that made residents straighten their spines automatically. "Silver Star," he said. 2 purple hearts. That's what the woman in this hallway has earned. That's what we're here to acknowledge. Dr. Ashford appeared from his office 15 seconds later, his face draining to the color of old bone. He'd been listening to his scanner. He'd heard the radio chatter. He'd put 2 and 2 together and come up empty because the math didn't exist in the official world anymore. An FBI agent in a charcoal suit stepped through the secondary entrance, her badge flashing. Behind her came 2 NCIS investigators. Their presence didn't announce itself, it consumed the air like pressure changing before a storm. The agent's voice was ice in a silk glove. "Dr. Marcus Ashford. You've been selling patient data on flagged military veterans to foreign brokers for 37 months. We have bank records. We have encrypted communications. We have 11 confirmed buyers operating out of Moscow, Beijing, and Tehran." Ashford tried to speak. Nothing came out. His mouth opened twice like a fish in a tank with the water drained. The hospital's IT specialist emerged from the stairwell, Martinez, a former Marine Lance Corporal with 18 years in IT and a temper like diesel fuel. He was holding a laptop, and his smile was the smile of a man who'd finally gotten to do something he'd been born to do. 14 hours of security footage from 6 camera angles. All preserved. All time-stamped. All showing Dr. Ashford attempting to delete the record of his terminal access at 2:48 a.m. last night. I sent copies to NCIS, the FBI, and the hospital board at 3:14 a.m. Before he even reached his car. The silence lasted exactly 4 seconds. Then Ashford screamed. Not words, a sound like an animal understanding that the trap had closed. His hand shot toward Martinez, toward the laptop, toward anything he could destroy, and he got exactly 1 step before the closest Ranger moved. Not violently. Just moved. Just stood in the way with the kind of presence that made physics seem optional. Ashford collapsed backward into a chair, and his face went through colors, red, white, grey, like he was cycling through every emotion before settling on the one that broke him. His voice came out shredded, words stumbling over each other. She was the only one who could have. She was flagged. She shouldn't have been here. I was protecting. I was just protecting. The FBI agent didn't even look at him. She was looking at Megan. Major O'Brien. We'd like you to come with us. There are some things we need to discuss about your status. Megan's son stepped forward, his hand finding her shoulder. Vance's eyes tracked her from the hospital bed. The SEAL leader nodded once, the kind of nod that meant permission, meant acknowledgement, meant welcome home. Yes, Megan said. Her voice had changed. The whisper was gone. What remained was the voice of a woman who'd stopped hiding. Give me 10 minutes to change. 6 months later, she walked past the night security desk where Ashford sat in an ill-fitting uniform. His name tag read security guard, part-time. His hand shook when residents called him by his old title out of habit. He flinched every time. His eyes dropped the moment he recognized her. Megan's major's insignia was visible now, not hidden, not ashamed, but honest. Her military liaison badge caught the light as she passed, the words clear, Director of Veterans Affairs, Seattle General. Around her neck, on a chain that wasn't broken anymore, hung a single dog tag. Vance's dog tag. He'd placed it in her palm during her last visit to his room with 3 words, "You earned it." She paused at the security desk. For a moment, they both stood in the amber glow of the hospital lights. Ashford waited for something, judgment, anger, words that would finally tear apart everything he'd tried to construct. Instead, Megan simply said, "The night shift needs better lighting in trauma. Have maintenance fixed the ballasts." Not an order. Not anymore. Just a statement about what needed to be done. And Ashford nodded once, his hand still shaking, and for the first time in 6 months, nobody had to ask him twice. That evening, after her shift, Megan stood on the balcony of her new apartment overlooking the harbor. The rain had stopped. The sky was clearing into that strange blue that comes after storms. Her son called her phone. He was deploying again next month, and they talked about nothing, the coffee place near his barracks, the price of gas, whether the Seahawks had a shot this season. Normal things. The things that normal people with normal lives discussed with their families. When he asked if she was happy, she didn't answer with words. She looked down at her scrubs, the ones she chose to wear now, the ones that meant something different now that everyone knew who she was. She touched the dog tag. She thought about the 12 officers on the hospital board who'd stood with her when the Pentagon called, who'd read the declassified operation summary, who'd wept during the deposition. "Yeah," she said finally. "Yeah, I am." Her son was quiet. "Then, you could come back. Full reinstatement. Pentagon's offering it." She already knew. The letter was on her kitchen counter, signed by 2 4-star generals. Full restoration of rank, back pay, command of the new Trauma Medicine Fellowship at Walter Reed. "My fight is here now," she said. And she meant it. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint, the discipline it took to choose mercy over rage, to choose rebuilding over burning everything down that had burned her. To choose a hospital full of people who couldn't defend themselves over a uniform and a title and all the power that came with those things. The hospital added the wing 3 months after Ashford's conviction. Veterans Affairs Trauma Center, funded by Pentagon grants and private donations from every SEAL team and Ranger battalion that had served under her command in Ramadi. The first patient through the doors on opening day was a 19-year-old private with a shattered femur and eyes that had seen things that had broken him. Megan was waiting in scrubs, with her major's insignia visible, with her hand steady, with her son's pride in her bones and her fallen team's memory sewn into her uniform. She didn't introduce herself as anything but what she was. "I'm Megan. I'm going to take care of you." And in that moment, the trembling stopped completely. What remained was clear and absolute and true, the kind of truth that needs no title to shine. Subscribe for more stories of hidden strength. Like if you believe that true class is what you do when the lights go out. Comment below, have you ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true value?